The phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, jolting Nathan Hale out of a light, uneasy sleep. He fumbled for it on the nightstand, his heart already pounding before he'd even registered why. Nobody called at this hour with good news. "Nathan." His sister Claire's voice came through ragged, choked with sobs. The kind of crying that sounds real, even when it isn't. "Dad died last night. He's gone." For a moment, Nathan's entire body went numb. The room seemed to tilt slightly, his father's face flashing through his mind. The two of them fishing together last summer, his father's laugh at Sunday dinners, the phone call just 2 nights earlier where they'd talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes because neither of them had wanted to hang up first. What happened? Was it his heart? "Claire, It doesn't matter what happened," Claire cut him off, her voice shifting with startling speed from grief to something colder, sharper. "I've already spoken to the lawyer. The estate is being handled. And I need you to understand something right now, Nathan. You get nothing. This is my inheritance. You made your choices years ago, and I'm not letting you swoop in now that he's gone." Nathan sat frozen on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, unable to process the whiplash of what he was hearing. His father dead, and in the same breath, his sister already dividing the spoils, already excluding him, already treating a supposed tragedy as a business transaction to be settled before the sun had fully risen. "Claire, I don't care about money right now. I just want to know what happened to—" "I have to go," she said abruptly. "Don't come to the funeral home. You're not welcome there. You're not really family anymore, not after everything." The line went dead. Nathan sat in stunned silence, staring at the phone in his trembling hand, grief and confusion and a strange, sick unease all tangled together in his chest. He didn't know how long he sat there before a calm, familiar voice spoke from behind him. "Who exactly died?" Nathan turned around so fast he nearly fell off the bed. His father, Walter Hale, stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom in a faded flannel robe, a mug of coffee in one hand, very much alive, very much confused, having simply woken up early in his son's house, where he'd been staying for the week during a visit, and wandered toward the kitchen only to overhear the tail end of a call about his own death. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Dad," Nathan finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was Claire. She just told me you died last night." Walter's eyebrows rose slowly, coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth. "I did what now?" To understand exactly how this bizarre, chilling phone call had come to happen, and exactly what kind of person could deliver news of a parent's death with more focus on inheritance than grief, you have to understand the family history that had quietly built toward this moment for years. Walter Hale was 71 years old, a retired civil engineer who had built a modest but comfortable fortune over 4 decades of careful work and even more careful saving. He'd raised 2 children, Nathan, steady and unassuming, who had built his own quiet, stable life as a high school teacher, and Claire, ambitious and restless, who had spent years drifting between business ventures that never quite succeeded the way she insisted they would, always requiring just one more loan, one more investment, one more advance against whatever she assumed her eventual inheritance would look like. The tension between the siblings had been building for years, though it rarely erupted into open conflict. Claire had always been the one who asked their father directly and repeatedly about his estate planning, how the house would be divided, what accounts existed, whether he'd updated his will recently. Questions dressed up as practical concern, but carrying an undertone Nathan had noticed, even if their father, ever generous in his interpretations of his daughter's motives, had mostly chosen to overlook it. Nathan, by contrast, rarely discussed money with his father at all, preferring simply to enjoy their relationship without the transactional undercurrent that seemed to define so much of Claire's interactions with him. Walter had been staying with Nathan for the week, a rare, pleasant visit meant to catch up properly after months of only phone calls, and it was pure coincidence, or perhaps something closer to fate, that had placed him within earshot of Claire's call that morning, close enough to hear his own daughter announce his death to his son, while simultaneously informing him he would receive nothing from the estate she was already, apparently, actively securing. Walter set his coffee mug down slowly on the dresser, his expression shifting from confusion into something colder, more focused. "Put her on speaker if she calls back," he said quietly. "I want to hear this myself." He didn't have to wait long. Claire called Nathan again 20 minutes later, apparently to add further instructions about the funeral arrangements she claimed were already underway. Nathan, hands shaking slightly, answered and put the call on speaker without a word, his father standing silently beside him, arms crossed, listening. "I need you to understand this isn't personal," Claire said, her earlier hysteria replaced now by a brisk, businesslike efficiency that somehow felt even more unsettling. "I've spoken with the hospital, the funeral home is already handling arrangements, and I've been in touch with Dad's lawyer about the estate. Everything is moving forward. I just need you to stay out of it." Walter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, gesturing for Nathan to keep her talking. "Which hospital?" Nathan asked carefully. "I want to know what happened, Claire. That's all. I'm not trying to interfere with anything." "Does it matter which hospital? He's gone, Nathan. The details aren't important right now. What's important is that the estate gets settled properly without complications." "Without complications," Nathan repeated slowly. "Meaning without me." "You made your choices," Claire said, an old worn grievance surfacing in her tone, something about years of perceived favoritism or slights that Nathan had never fully understood, and that Claire had apparently been nursing for far longer than he'd realized. "I'm not going to apologize for finally getting what I'm owed." The call ended shortly after, Claire promising to handle everything and instructing Nathan again not to show up anywhere, not to interfere, not to make things more difficult than they need to be. Walter stood in silence for several long minutes after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, deliberate, entirely different from the warm, easygoing tone Nathan had known his whole life. "I want to know exactly what she's been doing," Walter said. "All of it, starting now." Over the following days, Walter methodically began investigating exactly how far his daughter's deception extended, moving with the same careful, unhurried precision that had defined his entire engineering career. He called his physician directly, only to learn, unsurprisingly, that there had been no medical emergency, no hospital visit, nothing remotely resembling the crisis Claire had described. He called the hospital Claire had vaguely referenced, and after some searching, confirmed that no patient by his name had been admitted, treated, or processed in any capacity. He contacted his longtime attorney, a sharp, meticulous woman named Diane Whitfield, who had handled his estate planning for over a decade, and asked her directly whether anyone had recently contacted her office regarding his affairs. What Diane told him made Walter's expression go rigid, with a controlled fury Nathan had rarely witnessed in his father before. Claire had, in fact, contacted the office 3 days earlier, claiming she needed to begin preliminary paperwork in anticipation of an upcoming transition. A deliberately vague phrase Diane had found strange enough to note, but not alarming enough, at the time, to question further. Claire had asked pointed questions about the timeline for accessing joint accounts, about the process for transferring property, about whether power of attorney documents could be expedited under certain circumstances. Diane, professional and cautious, had given only general information, sensing something slightly off about the urgency, but having no reason at that point to suspect outright fraud. Further digging revealed even more. Claire had also contacted a local funeral home, inquiring about arrangements and pricing for a family member who would likely be passing soon. Language vague enough to avoid outright lying to the funeral director, but clearly designed to lay groundwork for exactly the story she'd eventually told Nathan. She had reached out to several extended family members over the preceding week, subtly planting the idea that their father's health had taken a serious turn, that things weren't looking good, carefully seeding the narrative she would later claim as fully realized fact, the moment it became convenient for her to do so. Nathan and his father spent the following days poring over financial records together, a process that revealed betrayals even more troubling than the fabricated phone call itself. Walter discovered several suspicious withdrawal attempts from a joint account he'd set up years earlier with Claire for convenience, purchases and transfers he hadn't authorized, timestamps clustered suspiciously around the same week as her, calls to the attorney and funeral home. There were emails, recovered through Walter's own account access, showing Claire had drafted, though apparently not yet submitted, paperwork, attempting to modify certain property documents, changes that would have required either his signature or convincing evidence of his incapacity or death to process legally. The full shape of what Claire had been attempting became disturbingly clear the more they uncovered. She hadn't simply made one cruel, premature phone call in a moment of confused panic. She had been quietly, deliberately laying the groundwork for exactly this scenario, waiting for an opportunity, or perhaps even manufacturing one, to claim her father had died before anyone could verify otherwise, using the chaos and grief of a supposed sudden death to rush through financial transitions before proper scrutiny could catch up with her. Walter sat with this knowledge for several days, processing not just the practical betrayal, but the deeper, more painful realization underneath it, that his own daughter had been willing to declare him dead to his living son, without hesitation or apparent guilt, purely in service of securing money faster than the normal process would have allowed. "I want to see how far she'll take this," Walter finally said, his voice steady despite the visible weight behind his eyes. "I want everyone to see exactly who she is, not just hear about it secondhand." He arranged a family dinner the following weekend, inviting Claire along with several extended relatives, an aunt and uncle, 2 cousins who had apparently already been told, in hushed, sympathetic phone calls from Claire, that Walter's death was recent and tragic. Nathan, still reeling from everything they'd uncovered, agreed to help his father orchestrate the confrontation, though the plan itself had been entirely Walter's idea, delivered with a calm, methodical resolve that reminded Nathan uncomfortably of watching his father solve complex engineering problems, patient, precise, utterly unwilling to leave anything to chance. The dinner took place at Walter's house, Claire arriving early to help manage arrangements, apparently having convinced herself and everyone else that she was now, functionally, the head of the family, settling into the role with an ease that suggested she'd been anticipating it for quite some time. She spoke openly at the table about funeral logistics, about which relatives needed to be informed, about preliminary decisions regarding the estate, entirely unaware that the man she was discussing was, at that very moment, standing just beyond the kitchen doorway, listening to every word. "I was thinking we do the service at Riverside," Claire said to their aunt, sipping wine with the casual authority of someone already comfortable in a role she hadn't actually earned. "Dad always liked that chapel, and honestly, once the estate clears, I think it makes sense for me to handle the house directly, given everything I've had to manage on my own these past few days." "Managing quite a lot, are you?" Walter said, stepping into the dining room. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire's wineglass slipped slightly in her hand, sloshing over the rim onto the white tablecloth, her face draining of color so completely that for a moment Nathan thought she might actually faint. Their aunt gasped audibly, one hand flying to her mouth. A cousin dropped his phone onto the table with a loud clatter, staring at Walter as though he were looking at an actual ghost, rather than a very alive, very composed 71-year-old man standing in his own dining room. "Dad," Claire finally managed, her voice cracking. You're supposed to be dead," Walter finished for her, walking calmly to the head of the table and taking his seat as though nothing unusual were happening at all. "Yes, I understand that's what you told everyone. I'd like to know why." Claire's composure, so effortless moments earlier, collapsed entirely under the weight of the question. She reached first for confusion as an excuse. "There must have been some kind of mix-up. I don't understand how this—" "A mix-up," Walter repeated evenly. "Would you like to explain how you mixed up my death with contacting my attorney about accessing my accounts? Or mixed up my death with calling a funeral home to price arrangements? Or mixed up my death with attempting to modify property documents that would only make sense if I were, in fact, actually dead?" Claire's face cycled rapidly through several failed explanations. "The hospital told me," she started, before Walter cut her off gently but firmly. "I called the hospital myself. They have no record of my ever being admitted. I called my doctor. He has no idea what you're talking about. There was no hospital call, Claire. There was no mix-up. There was a plan, and I'd like you to explain it to everyone at this table right now, since you were so eager to explain the funeral arrangements a few minutes ago." Claire tried once more, her voice shifting towards something more desperate. "I've just been under so much stress, I genuinely believed something had happened. I panicked, and maybe I said some things I shouldn't have." "You told my son I was dead," Walter said quietly, and something in his tone, not raised, not furious, simply devastatingly clear, silenced the room completely. "You told him he wasn't welcome to attend a funeral for a death that never happened." You told him he would receive nothing from an inheritance you were already quietly working to secure for yourself alone. None of that sounds like panic to me, Claire. It sounds like a plan that simply happened to fail because I was standing in the next room. The extended relatives around the table sat frozen, the earlier warmth of the gathering having evaporated entirely, replaced by the particular, uncomfortable silence of people watching a family's carefully maintained facade collapse in real time. Their aunt, visibly shaken, looked back and forth between Walter and Claire, as though trying to reconcile the version of events she'd been told with the one now unfolding in front of her. Walter didn't raise his voice again. He simply laid out, calmly and methodically, everything he and Nathan had uncovered over the preceding days. The calls to the attorney, the inquiries at the funeral home, the attempted account access, the drafted property documents. Each piece of evidence landed with the same quiet, devastating weight, Claire's protests growing weaker and less convincing with every new detail, until finally she simply stopped trying to explain herself at all, sitting in silence with tears streaming down her face, though whether from genuine remorse or simple humiliation at being caught, Nathan honestly couldn't say. The consequences began almost immediately, moving with the same methodical precision Walter had applied to uncovering the deception in the first place. Within days, he had formally revoked Claire's access to every joint account they'd shared, working directly with the bank to freeze anything she might still attempt to access. He removed her entirely from the power of attorney documents that had previously named her as his designated decision-maker in the event of incapacity, replacing her instead with Nathan, whose steady, unassuming loyalty had never once wavered despite years of watching his sister receive more attention, more financial support, and more benefit of the doubt from their father. Diane Whitfield, working swiftly once Walter formally engaged her, began the process of completely restructuring his estate plan, ensuring that whatever Claire had hoped to secure through deception and manipulation would no longer be available to her at all, regardless of how the original will might have once been structured. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the extended family, the story simply too dramatic and too unsettling to remain contained within the immediate household. Relatives who had initially believed Claire's fabricated account of their father's death, who had grieved genuinely, who had begun making their own arrangements to attend a funeral for a man very much alive, felt a particular sharp betrayal upon learning the truth. Several reached out to Nathan directly in the following weeks, offering apologies for having doubted him, for having initially sided with Claire's dramatic account without questioning its details more carefully. Others turned their disapproval more directly toward Claire herself, several extended family members quietly distancing themselves from her entirely, unwilling to maintain close relationships with someone who had proven capable of fabricating a parent's death for personal financial gain. Claire's downfall, once set into motion, proved difficult to reverse. She lost not just her father's trust and her financial standing within the family, but a considerable portion of her broader social circle as well, as the story, impossible to fully contain, made its way through mutual friends and acquaintances who found the details simply too shocking to keep quiet about. Business contacts she'd cultivated over years of failed ventures, people who had perhaps overlooked her questionable judgment before, grew notably more distant once whispers of the incident reached them. The reputation she'd built, however precariously, collapsed under the weight of what she'd attempted. Walter, for his part, spent considerable time in the weeks following the confrontation reflecting on what the entire experience had revealed to him. Not just about Claire, but about the broader dynamics he'd allowed to persist within his family for years, without fully examining them. He explained to Nathan, during one of their long conversations on the back porch, that he'd always known Claire held a certain preoccupation with the eventual inheritance, but he'd told himself, repeatedly, that it was simply practical concern, a reasonable interest in understanding her financial future. He hadn't wanted to believe it ran deeper than that, hadn't wanted to confront the possibility that his own daughter viewed him, at least in part, as an obstacle standing between herself and money she felt entitled to. Inheritance is something you earn through love and integrity, Walter told Nathan one evening, watching the sun set over the backyard they'd spent so many summers in together. Not something you're owed simply because you share blood with someone. I think I let myself forget that distinction for longer than I should have. He made several deliberate changes to his estate plan in the months that followed, working closely with Diane to ensure his final wishes reflected the values he actually held, rather than simply the family structure he'd inherited by default. He allocated a meaningful portion of his estate to a scholarship fund supporting first-generation engineering students, a cause close to his own professional history, wanting some part of his legacy to extend meaningfully beyond his immediate family. He updated the remainder of his plan to reflect what he now understood more clearly than ever, that loyalty, patience, and genuine care mattered far more than the entitled assumption that inheritance was simply owed by default. He thanked Nathan directly, more than once, in the weeks and months that followed, for the quiet, consistent loyalty he'd shown throughout their entire relationship, loyalty that had never once been transactional, that had never once come with an unspoken expectation of eventual financial reward. Nathan, for his part, found the acknowledgement almost uncomfortable, insisting repeatedly that he'd never done anything more than simply love his father the way any son should, without needing the gesture recognized or rewarded. Their relationship, already close, deepened considerably in the aftermath of everything that had happened. They spent more time together deliberately now, weekend visits that had once been occasional becoming a regular, comfortable rhythm. Fishing trips, quiet dinners, long conversations that ranged from nostalgic memories to Walter's occasional wry observations about how strange it had been, however briefly, to overhear his own daughter announce his death with more urgency about inheritance than actual grief. Family gatherings, once large and occasionally strained under the weight of Claire's simmering resentments and expectations, grew smaller and considerably more peaceful in the time that followed. The extended relatives who remained close were the ones who had shown genuine concern and support throughout the ordeal, rather than those who had simply orbited the family in anticipation of whatever benefits proximity to Walter's eventual estate might eventually provide. What the gatherings lost in size, they gained considerably in warmth, an authenticity that Nathan hadn't fully realized had been missing from so many of the larger, more crowded family occasions of years past. Claire attempted, on a handful of occasions, to reach out and repair the relationship, though her efforts remained oddly focused, even months later, on discussions of financial fairness, rather than genuine remorse for what she'd actually done. Walter listened to each attempt with the same calm, measured patience he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, but remained firm in the boundaries he'd established, unwilling to simply restore trust that had been so deliberately, calculatedly broken. He told her, during one particularly difficult conversation, that he would always love her as his daughter, that the door to a genuine relationship remained open should she ever choose to walk through it with real accountability, rather than continued negotiation over what she still believed she was owed. But the financial trust, the responsibilities, the role she had once assumed she would simply inherit by default, those, he made clear, were not coming back. Reflecting on everything that had unfolded, months later, sitting once again on that same back porch with his father on a quiet evening, Nathan found himself turning the entire experience over in his mind, trying to understand what exactly it had revealed. Beyond the obvious shock of that early morning phone call, he came to understand that greed, when left unexamined for long enough, had a particular way of destroying families long before any actual money changed hands, that the mere anticipation of inheritance, the quiet, corrosive calculation of what one might eventually be owed, could poison relationships every bit as thoroughly as the money itself, once it finally arrived, often did. He understood, more clearly than he ever had before, that trust, patiently built and consistently honored over years, held a value that no dollar amount could ever fully replicate, and that its absence, once revealed, was almost impossible to fully repair. He thought often about the particular clarity of that moment his father had walked into the dining room, alive and composed, watching his own daughter's carefully constructed story collapse in an instant. How completely a person's true character could reveal itself the moment they believed, with absolute certainty, that no one was actually watching. Claire had believed, in that early morning phone call, that she was simply claiming what she felt entitled to. Instead, without meaning to, she had exposed exactly who she'd quietly become in front of the one audience she could never have anticipated, her own supposedly deceased father, standing just close enough to hear every word. Nathan understood finally, sitting beside his father in the fading evening light, that sometimes the greatest gift a parent could ultimately leave behind wasn't measured in property or savings, or carefully divided inheritance at all. Sometimes, the most valuable thing a parent left behind was simply the truth about the family they'd built, about the people within it, and about which of those relationships had actually been built on love all along, rather than on the quiet, patient calculation of what one day eventually might be owed.